We continue with our series called The Prophets, God's Messengers through the story of the Bible. And today our theme is Ezekiel, Daniel, and Obadiah. Hope in exile. I'm not sure how I'm going to get through these prophets in half an hour, but we're going to try. If you missed our sermon last Sunday, this is kind of an extended podcast version of that so that you can catch up. I've been saying every single week, I know I sound like a stuck record, but that it's a really good idea, particularly if you struggle with the Old Testament, to read the Old Testament through the lens of the prophets. But that is not my idea. Just to say, the idea comes straight from Jesus. And I want to start today with those two disciples on the Emmaus Road. You'll know the story of the Emmaus Road. Just after Jesus' crucifixion and burial, on the first day of the week, Luke 24, the disciples are downcast. They're really sad. It has been the worst nightmare weekend ever. The first Easter weekend was the worst nightmare weekend ever. And two disciples, Cleopas and friend, head out of the city of Jerusalem to a town called Emmaus. And they're walking away from the city. And it's about 7 or 8 miles, I think. These days, scholars are unsure of exactly where Emmaus is or which town it is, but that's kind of what we have. It's about 7 or 8 miles anyway. And they're on the road. They're downcast, and they see a stranger. And the stranger comes alongside of them. And they don't recognize who he is. Okay, that's quite key. And he says to them, well, why are you so downcast? And they're like, they get quite heated about this. They're like, well, do you not know what's happened in Jerusalem? The Messiah, the one, our hero who we followed, who we put all our hope and our trust in, everything, was crucified, etc., etc. And anyway, this stranger then gives them a lecture or a sermon. And we see there, Luke 24, 25 to 7. And beginning with Moses, and all the prophets, he explains to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Wow. Okay. Amazing. So Jesus unpacks the Bible, the Old Testament, through the lens of the prophets. So maybe we ought to do as well. And that's kind of what we've been doing over the last few months. And we started, as you'll remember, with Moses and Samuel and Elijah and Elisha and Isaiah and Jeremiah. And today we're looking at Ezekiel, Daniel, and Obadiah. You can see there the dates and the times when they lived. If you want to push pause and just look at those dates, give you an idea of the biblical timeline from Exodus at Moses to exile. And if you see on the right of the slide, it looks really, really messy. And that's because the nation of Israel at that time is really, really messy. Last week I said that there were kind of, the kingdom had split at this point. There were two parts, the northern part, which was actually called Israel, and then the southern part, which was called Judah, which Jerusalem is in. 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire comes charging in, conquers the northern part of Israel, takes people captive back to Assyria. That is just laid waste completely. And then in 586 BC, the Babylonians come over and they completely crush the southern part, Jerusalem, Judah. And Ezekiel, Daniel, and Obadiah are living during this period. What a period to live. I mean, kind of horrendous, the things that these guys would have witnessed. And how did we get here? We got here because of broken covenant. We've seen it repeated all the way through. Bad leaders, false gods, injustice to the poor, failing to keep that covenant law that Moses set up for them all the way back, And so they head into exile. And what does exile mean? Exile means loss of everything. It means loss of land, it means loss of temple, it means loss of king, it means loss of priest, people, law, national religious identity, everything. this is really, really serious for the people of God. And they would have been asking, well, where is God in all of this? And so to understand exile, I want to kind of ask you a personal question. And this is it. When you lose everything personally, is God still God? When you lose everything personally, is God still God? I don't know if you've ever done like a faith inventory, where you look at all the things in your life that you take for granted, like your home, your bed, the food in the fridge, the safety of your streets, your pension, money in the bank, your job, your family, your children. What if you lost these things? I know that sounds like a really morbid thought, but I actually know that some of you listening to this would have gone through some of these things. And so this is the reality of life, living in a fallen world. And perhaps the longer you live in this fallen world, some of these things are inevitable. But what if you lost everything? There was a benchmark book that I read when I was about 17 or 18. I remember the book well. It's never left me. It's called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. It's about a guy called Jean-Dominique Bauby who had a stroke. He was a successful fashion designer. He had money in the bank. He had family. He had a great life. But that was taken away in a moment. And he had a stroke, and he had this rare form of effect on his body, which people call locked-in syndrome. He described as like being locked in to a diving bell. And the only thing in his body that he could move was his eyelid. And I remember reading the book, and as I read the book, I discovered that he actually dictated the book by flapping his eyelid. And so he had a scribe, and the number of times he flapped his eyelid, corresponded to the letters of the alphabet, and then and it's about a 120-page book, and it's so moving that he writes his story down this way. And I'm not going to give anything away. Go away and read the book. But there are points in the story that isn't just incredibly moving points where he contemplates or hints, I would rather say hints, that he's not alone in the universe. I'll leave that for you to discover in the thing. But I bring this book up because I think it's healthy that we ask these very personal questions about exile. What if you lost everything? And so we learn some lessons when we look at Israel's account of exile. When you lose everything, lesson number 1, is God still God? You might say, having been through something very, very difficult in your life, you might say, yeah, of course, God is still God. I saw that. God helped me. But in the ancient Near East, you have to remember, things work a little differently. I've put together a pyramid hierarchy there for you to look at. And this is how religion in the ancient Near East worked, whether it's the Egyptians, whether it's the Mesopotamians, whether it's the Canaanites, Israel during the time of Solomon. You had the god at the top of the tree here. You had the temple, you had the king, you had the priests, you had the merchant class, and you had the slave class all there. And that's how your political religious order worked. And it depended on things like military might, the fertility of the land, prosperity, all of these things. And so if you take all of these things away as an exile, is God really still God? And the surrounding nations laughed at Israel and mocked them. Nations like Edom, we see this in the book of Obadiah. can God still be God? Do you even have a religion? I mean, what does that even mean? And there, if you open Ezekiel 11:16, we see this extraordinary little passage. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Although I sent them far away among the nations and scattered them among the countries, yet for a little while I have been a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. Wow, this is a political, religious crisis nightmare. God is like, no, I've got this. I am still your God. And you are still my people. And I will journey with you wherever you go. In fact, I sent you to these places. Whew, okay. That's something that, they would need to process. But I think, all the way through the prophets, we've learned quite a bit about God. This is a God who is like no other God. Okay, this is the God who creates the heavens and the earth. This is the God who parts the sea. This is the God who speaks powerfully through his creation. Remember Mount Carmel, drought, fire, rain. This is the God who journeys, tabernacles with his people, whether it's in Egypt, into the wilderness, into the deserts. This is the God who's remains with his people, whether there's a temple of stone or a tent in the desert. And so, by now, yeah, okay, all right. When you lose everything, is God still God? Yeah, I think he is. And we get this through the prophet Ezekiel. And it's like a tonic if you're an Israelite reading that. And then the second lesson of exile is a really serious one, and it's something that Israel need to confront. And Ezekiel gives us this vision, Ezekiel 37. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me by the Spirit of the Lord, and he sent me in the middle of a valley. It was a valley of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, the bones that were very dry. And he asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? This is a horrendous picture, and I don't want to theologize it too much, We have modern day valleys of dry bones, sadly. The Holocaust in Germany and Poland, what was done to the Jews in these concentration camps. These are valleys of dry bones. Utter, complete devastation, Rwanda in the 1990s was a valley of dry bones. Sudan is a valley of dry bones. Gaza, people, wake up. Gaza is a valley of dry bones. These are horrendous, awful things. What Ezekiel is looking at is not just a vision. It would have been a reality, a literal reality of what Jerusalem might have looked like. The Kidron Valley, just bones, dead bodies everywhere, and laid waste. And when you encounter a vision like that, there is actually nothing you can do. The temptation is either to blame yourself or to blame the surrounding nations. Yeah, look what they do. Or or try and fix the situation. A few weeks back, we looked at the prophet Isaiah, and I spoke about this word sin and how we don't really understand the full extent of this word sin. The word sin is the word in Hebrew, katar. It means to miss the mark. But we miss the mark in a couple of different ways. We sin is the things that we do to other people and God's creation. That's one way of turning away from God. The bad things that we do to other people and God's creation. Sin is also the bad things that other people do to us, the scars that we carry from other people. It's all part of the same thing, sin. And then sin is also the culture that we are a product of. The sea that we swim in. We don't even realize, but our culture will influence us in a certain way. And so when you encounter the valley of dry bones, you have to say, well, how did Israel get to this point? Well, we saw that it's through breaking of the covenant, but actually, the surrounding nations of Assyria and Babylon did these things to Israel. It's all part of the same package, and so the temptation is, you blame yourself, you blame other people, or you seek to try and fix this one, and sometimes it's like, I'm going to pick up a gun, I'm going to pick up a bomb, I'm going to go and I'm going to teach these surrounding nations a lesson for what they did. But in history, we realize that, when history repeats itself, that's kind of the worst part of history, evil just perpetuates over and over again, if, I'll take revenge, and you become like your enemies. You just become worse and worse. And Israel becomes like all the surrounding nations. They're constantly reminded, God reminds Israel that I want you to be a holy people. I want you to be different to all the surrounding nations because I am different. And so if you want a phrase for, to sum up Ezekiel and Obadiah, it's I will. Not you will, Israel. I will. I will. God says, you are dead. You are completely dead in your sins. If you have a heart made of stone, Ezekiel 36, you are dead. You need a heart of flesh. God says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove your heart of stone and I will give you a heart of flesh. I will. There is nothing you can do. Can these bones live? Ezekiel, you alone know, Lord, and we see that this is the God who can make life out of death, out of nothing, who can bring life out of nothing. So that's the second, it's a kind of conflict of the wills. God says, I will, not you will. We pray the prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your will be done. Your will be done. Your kingdom come. But we're always in conflict with our own will, and that's sin. And so we turn away from God because we follow our own wills so often and not the will of God. The third lesson we learn in exile is in the book of Daniel. Bear in mind, Daniel, unlike Ezekiel and Obadiah, was in exile his whole life. Ezekiel and Obadiah was for a shorter period, and they were sort of would have got back to the land somehow and perhaps seen a little bit of restoration and that. But Daniel remains in Babylon for the rest of his life. Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get transported over to Babylon in the exile. They're given new names, they're given new education, they're forced to eat different food, they are forced to serve under the king Nebuchadnezzar, and they forced to immerse themselves in a completely different culture, and they do that pretty well. And so much so that Nebuchadnezzar actually has huge amounts of respect for them. But they have a red line, and their red line is to worship the gods of Babylon. And so when Nebuchadnezzar sets up this massive statue of himself and forces people to bow down and worship him and the other gods, Daniel and his friends say no. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are threatened with the fiery furnace. And it's not just a threat, it's a real thing. And I love this picture we get in Daniel chapter 3. They say to Nebuchadnezzar, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from that. You see, they know their God well. He is with them. But, verse 18, even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Wow. Even if he does not. In other words, we will follow our God even unto death, because he is the God who can bring life out of death. That is amazing. And so they go into the fiery furnace, they stoke the furnace up to get like super hot and everything else, and da da da. And later on in the passage, we look down and Nebuchadnezzar looks into the fiery furnace and he says, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbounded, unharmed, and the 4th looks like the Son of God." Wow. Gosh, who is this 4th person? There were only 3 people that went in. Who's the 4th person? Oh, wow. You know, have a guess. And we see a similar story with Daniel in the lion's den. He gets thrown into the lion's den, and God shuts the mouth of the lions, and he comes out absolutely fine again. And so the third lesson of exile could be something like, I am going to get you out of this mess, but not before you have journeyed with me in the mess. This is another hard lesson in patience, you know. God doesn't spare us the messes of this life. If you talk to people who have been Christians for some time, they will tell you that, yeah, he definitely doesn't spare you. But actually, perhaps we learn the most in the mess, and I don't want to simplify that too much, because maybe that's something we only learn when we're out the other side of the mess, you know. So I don't want to romanticize that or simplify that too much. But if you read the biblical account, God does take us into messes, and the way we are asked to interpret that is not that God is distant or he's abandoned us, but actually that he's closer to us in the mess. And this is actually the nature of the cross of Jesus. We don't have time to unpack that more. We'll unpack that another time. But yeah, at the center of Christianity is the cross. It is Christ hanging there shouting, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I mean, in the absolute depth of despair. And so Daniel learns this lesson, and this is what exile means for them. But it doesn't end there, because there's little snippets of information all the way through Daniel, which I find extremely exciting. If you want to look up Daniel 5:11, we have this very interesting little piece of information that Nebuchadnezzar made Daniel chief of the wise men and astrologers. And you think, oh, okay, yeah. So what about that? Well, duh. You know, at Christmas, you know, who were the guys who were following a star? Who were the guys who somehow had copies of Daniel's prophecies in their writings? You know, all the way outside of Israel, wise men from the east have these copies, and they come and they find the baby wrapped in the manger. Yeah, following the star. Oh, da 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 da. Daniel was head of the wise men. I don't know. I love making these little connections in the Bible, but that's a quite exciting connection, you know. Just journey with me in the mess, because I've got a plan, Daniel. I'm going to work this thing out. And right at the end of Daniel, from Daniel 7 onwards, we see this extraordinary vision, this plan, and how it starts to come together. And Daniel 7:13 to 14, we have this vision of someone called one like the Son of Man. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. Wow. Who is this? You know, who is this one like the Son of Man? Who is the 4th person in the fiery furnace? You know, he was the one who shut the mouths of the lions. I mean, like, God is there with them in this place, and he's showing them this. I am with you. And it leads us quite neatly back to the Emmaus Road. These 2 downcast disciples, they see the stranger. Remember I said they haven't recognized who he is yet. And why are they on the road to Emmaus? Well, just a little bit of extra information. in 3 Maccabees. It's a extra biblical Jewish source, not in the Old Testament of the Bible. It records that in 165 BC there was a guy called Judas Maccabeus, and he was a Jewish martyr outside the town of Emmaus, and he defeated the mighty Seleucid Empire in one battle, but then he got taken out later on. He was a hero of theirs, and you think, well, maybe they were going to Emmaus to get some moral support, like the hero we thought was our hero was crucified on the weekend, so let's go and try and find another hero. And Judas Maccabeus, he was our martyr, he was our hero. His stone tablet is there in Emmaus. Let's go up to Emmaus and hang out there, just give ourselves a little bit of a boost. Maybe that's why they headed up there. I don't know. But Emmaus is an interesting town from that point of view. And of course, they meet the stranger on the road, and he explains to them how the whole Old Testament fits to him. And suddenly, this hero is no longer, I suppose what they reckon, they go back to their house in Emmaus, and he breaks the bread, the stranger, and as he breaks the bread, they recognize who it is, and it's Jesus. And wow, he's not just a piece of stone with a record, a dead martyr. He's actually living. He is resurrected. He's real. He came through death, and he is now alive. And it completely blows their minds, so much so that all their fear of Jerusalem and everything else goes away, and they get up immediately and they head straight back for Jerusalem. It's amazing. Their whole worldview has shifted. Everything has changed by encountering the risen Jesus on the road. And they say, I love that. They say, in Luke 24:32, were our hearts not burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? Fly on the wall moment. Would you have just loved to be there on that road, on that Emmaus road? And we have to, ask ourselves, what was he teaching them? Well, I think in a fascinating sort of way, Jesus was putting the little pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. Because remember, with exile, I spoke about the loss of everything, the loss of king and temple and priest and law and covenant and people and all of these things that we lose because of exile are actually then fulfilled in Jesus. And I think Jesus would have been talking about these things, these things would have clicked for them. Of course, he is the King of Kings, Lords of Lords, the King who lives forever, the King who is completely sinless, unlike all the other kings that have followed. Revelation 19:11-16, you can go and read that. He is the great high priest, Hebrews 4:14-16. He is the temple. In John 2:19-21, Jesus says, tear this temple down, and I will rebuild it in 3 days. The Pharisees kick off, what is he on about? Tear this temple down. And John explains to us, he's not talking about the physical building. He's talking about his body. And then we go on, he is the lamb, sacrificed once and for all. The temple's gone. How are we going to sacrifice? Jesus becomes the lamb who is sacrificed once and for all. John 1:29, and over again throughout the Bible, Jesus is the lamb. And then Jesus is the law. Like Matthew 5:17, I have not come to abolish the law of all the prophets. I have come to fulfill them. In John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, And then 14, and the Word became flesh. We have seen his glory. He is the blood of the new covenant. His blood is the blood of the new covenant. We saw that last week, Luke 22:20. Hebrews 9:15. All the jigsaw puzzles on the road to Emmaus are coming together. And then, he is Emmanuel, God with us, even in our darkest hour, even in the fiery furnace, even amongst the lions, even in the desert, in a tent. God is with us. And Matthew brings out, Isaiah 7, Emmanuel, and then Matthew brings out Matthew 1, 22-23. All these jigsaw puzzle pieces are coming together. And so, what do we see? Israel come back to the land, and they rebuild the temple, and then the temple gets knocked over again, and they rebuild it for the second time, and they're invaded by the Persians, and they're invaded by the Romans, and then the Romans sack the temple in AD 70, and it's never the same physically. The land and the temple and the political hierarchy and the king and all of that stuff is never the same again physically. But all that stuff becomes reality in the Messiah, in the Christ, in Jesus, our Savior. And so that, in a way that, almost is too big for our brains to comprehend. But all of that stuff is true only because of resurrection. If Jesus was just another dead martyr like Judas Maccabeus, well, what's the point? Yeah, you can sit around the stone and get a little bit of a morale boost. But if he is really living, then we know that we can trust God even in death to bring life. And so I'll end this section here, but you'll need to go away and read Ezekiel, Obadiah, and Daniel. They are great books. There's so much we could have plowed in, and if you have any questions, just shout. But yeah, this is where we are on our series. Thanks for listening. Bye.